Thanks. Mr. Lewis, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. I'm Jim Lewis. I work at CSIS. Thanks for sticking around. I think this is the best panel of the day. Admiral Rogers is about 10 minutes out coming from the Pentagon, so barring unforeseen traffic on K Street or something, he ought to be here shortly. We're going to go ahead and start because we'd like to end as closely as possible to time. I think they've done this in the past. You're going to get cards that you fill out if you have questions, and then they'll pass them up, and I'll throw out the ones I don't like. I won't throw them out. I'll just put them to the bottom of the stack. Let me introduce our two speakers who are here. You probably know both these guys, but just in case you don't, Matt Olsen, the former director of NCTC and the former acting attorney general at NSD, which is why we're here today, currently at IronNet Security, which you're the CEO, right? No?
No.
No, I thought
someday
he was.
maybe.
Just say yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Because you elevated me to the acting attorney general too. I was acting assistant attorney general. So
Can I read that? That sounded much better, don't you think?
It did. Yeah. Who's counting?
Okay, we'll go with it. And next to him is, I'll get it right this time, Adam Zubin, who's the acting undersecretary for terrorism and financial intelligence at Treasury, and of course was the head of OFAC for many years before that, an office that most of you are familiar with. So our topic today is next generation threats. And I wanted to set the stage just a little bit because I think this probably came up before, but if you hadn't noticed, the 25 years of peace that followed the end of the Cold War, great power peace, stable relations among great powers, those 25 years are over. We're in a new environment, it's more conflictual, we have opponents, and how that will shape remains to be determined since it's relatively new. We have a whole set of crises around the world that challenge everyone. Terrorism is one, espionage is another. There's all sorts of geographic, pick a country we can have a crisis for if you want. And we have powerful opponents who are challenging the US in a way that we have not been challenged in a long time. So that's the environment. Someone told me, I did a briefing on the Hill before this, and they told me I was too gloomy. So we will tell jokes at the end to cheer you up. But I think we're actually in a tough situation. The topic is responding to next generation threats, but I thought maybe the two of you could start by telling us, what are the next generation threats? What are the things that you're looking down the road to see? Matt, do you want to go first?
Sure. So let me just begin by thanking you, Jim, and CSIS, but also saying hello to all my friends and former colleagues from the National Security Division, and how proud I am to be here with you all this afternoon. I was here a little bit this morning and got to hear David and Pat and Ken talk with John. What a great institution. So next generation threats. I mean, the one thing that comes to mind immediately, and it's really not next generation, it's really this generation, but it's going to be with us for some time, and that's in the terrorism realm, the change in threats we face. And again, you guys know this better than I do. You're living it. And that's sort of the lone wolf type attack and smaller scale attacks that we're seeing now. And I think we're going to continue to see as really ISIS has established a playbook for using the internet to radicalize people, to mobilize people to violence, for getting away from the more catastrophic, significant, complex, sophisticated attack that was the hallmark of Al-Qaeda. And that's just a huge challenge for everybody in the counterterrorism community. How do you respond to attacks that are so simple to pull off, but that have an outsized impact in terms of the level of fear they engender, and in some ways really similar to the effect of a bigger attack, because they are lethal, but the sense that we are so vulnerable, and that sense that those types of attacks create. So I think that when I think about next generation attacks, next generation threats, I know there are a number of them, but that's the one that comes to mind first for me.
Okay. Adam.
Well, I also want to start by thanking you and thanking CSIS and thanking John Carlin and the National Security Division for inviting me. This is one of the offices that I work with most closely out of my office at Treasury, and in many senses we're sister offices. We are about 12 years old, not much older, and likewise we're created in the post 9/11 environment with, I think, many of the same organizing principles. It's not about adding new capabilities. We're using tools and experience and authorities that Treasury has had for decades, but pulling them together with a new focus on national security and the thinking, and I think it's been borne out certainly in the case of NSD, and I hope in our office, is that you then cultivate an expertise and you are able to think in a more nuanced way about how to counter some of these threats. So it really is an honor to be here. For us, naturally, it won't surprise you, we have our eyes on the cyber threat, whether that's on cyber espionage, commercial theft. The president announced a new cyber executive order arming us with the same targeted sanctions authorities that we've used against narcotics cartels and transnational criminal organizations and terrorist groups. We're now equipped to use those against cyber actors. Being legally equipped to use sanctions as a tool isn't the same thing as having the intelligence and having the ability to make an impact by using the tool. And I would readily acknowledge that the cyber threat is far more challenging when it comes to using our tools effectively than some of those other threats. I also worry as I look down the road about increasing tools and technologies to mask financial trails. This is something that my colleagues across government encounter in law enforcement and intelligence. If you're talking about end-to-end encryption on communications side, well, that's a major threat in terms of anyone trying to listen in to a suspected criminal or to a terrorist. But for us, it's all about following the money. And all sorts of technologies are being devised and exploited every day to be able to mask financial trails, and some of them are quite advanced and quite difficult to pierce. That's a worry for us because we see the bad guys adapt very quickly, and if they find something that works, whether they discover it in the world of narcotics finance or terrorist finance, it will quickly spread and be adopted by other bad actors who we're trying to stop. So that's something I too worry about at night.
Yeah, we're about to release a report on encryption that tried to look at data, and it's a little embarrassing because people who use end-to-end encryption are largely regular folks, but increasingly terrorists, criminals are drawn to end-to-end encryption. So it's and I want to come back to the tools question, but something Director Comey said that both of you touched on this morning. He talked about how cooperation has improved in the federal government for the national security mission, certainly since the time he's been around. Both of you in relatively new organizations, you for both NSD and NCTC, Adam with the conglomeration at Treasury. How's it working? What do you make of it?
So, I mean, look, this room really is proof of one of the really true successes of the post 9/11 era for the government. And it's not a particularly sexy story. You know, the bureaucratic story is not always the one that's going to get headlines. But the story of how the government reorganized itself at Treasury, in the intelligence community, and most relevant to this discussion within the Justice Department with the FBI. And I saw this from my perch at the National Counterterrorism Center. We were sort of at the hub of a lot of this activity, and the reality is it's a really positive, good news story, how effective the government is at working together on counterterrorism, on understanding the threat and then operationally going after the threat. And to put it a little bit more concretely, and this is, I haven't followed this case recently, but it's a case very close to home, literally, and that's the Abu Khatala case out of Libya. This is one of the individuals charged in connection with the Benghazi attacks. And I use that as an example of, you see in one particular case, this guy was captured in Benghazi, taken out of Benghazi by the U.S. military, put on a ship, brought back here to the United States, and is now pending trial in the district court down the road here in D.C. And here, so you have incredible military capability, and second to none. No other country in the world could even think about carrying out an operation like that, so far away from home. supported by intelligence community coming together, providing the information that led and supported that capture, and then law enforcement and justice, those tools coming together. And all really done without anyone thinking twice about how we're going to do this together. This was an example a couple years ago of all of those authorities and capabilities working seamlessly together. And I think we probably couldn't have done that before 9/11.
I couldn't agree more. And I'm not always one to sort of boost the U.S. government's efforts when it comes to our bureaucracy. We do have a very heavy bureaucracy, and it can be frustrating. But in terms of intelligence sharing, information sharing, and coordination on the top national security threats, I think it's working really, really well. And I have that as sort of a regular understanding. When you travel overseas and see how other governments are struggling with this, you end up feeling struck by how impressive our strides have been. And I'm not talking about developing countries. I'm talking about well-developed, advanced countries, some of our closest allies in Europe. I don't have a natural counterpart in almost any government because I work on national security functions out of a finance ministry, and we're the only finance ministry in the world that has this. We have a built-in intelligence office. No other finance ministry in the world does. So I get that. We're something of an odd hybrid. But as a result, when I travel, I go meet with the intelligence folks, the national security folks. I meet with finance ministry, central bank, financial intelligence unit, and it is incredible how little communication there is among those offices, even in very advanced countries. And I've had the exasperating, maybe even dispiriting experience many times of needing to share information within a government on behalf of that government. So we'll receive intelligence that's relevant to a financial threat, and I'll raise it with my counterpart in the finance ministry. They'll say, we don't know about that. Can you help us get it? We'll put into our intelligence community to have it downgraded for sharing with the country that gave it to us in the first place. I'm not kidding about any of this. And then go out and deliver it as if it was something from us. And they're like, wow, terrific. Can you just make sure we see this in the future? And then I say, can you make sure that you see this in the future? This is not the way it's supposed to work. But that's a situation. I thought, frankly, the really horrible attacks we saw in some of the European capitals would have that galvanizing effect that 9/11 did for us, and sad to say, I don't think it has.
Yeah, the handoff in Europe is not always as smooth as you might hope. I guess I should introduce him, even though he's late, but, let's see here. No, of course. Admiral Michael Rogers. Oh, questions, how exciting. Admiral Michael Rogers, who many of us have known in this business for a long time, both at Pacific Command and then at 10th Fleet, and now, of course, as the head of both Cyber Command and NSA. And you came at an opportune moment.
There you go.
So
it's all about timing in life.
Yeah, that's right. The question we were talking about is, NSD, the Treasury Office, NCTC, these are all sort of integrative efforts, and how much better does it work in the federal government than, say, it used to? Where are we seeing success in integration between the different communities, law enforcement, Treasury, intelligence?
So from my perspective, having been an intelligence professional in the uniform world now for 30 years, it's a whole lot better. The biggest changes are never underestimate the ability of a trauma in the form of 9/11 to drive fundamental change in hierarchical organizations that are often resistant to change. And I think we got to be honest with ourselves. It took the pain of 9/11 to drive fundamental change for us. I can remember as an intelligence professional, this huge wall we had between, well, what is intelligence, what is law enforcement, what is counterintelligence? And we had these three kind of broad bins, and it was very difficult to merge the three. It's one of the things in discussions with my European teammates, as we look at the sad events that they have had to deal with, I still think they're trying to work their way through what are the fundamental structural information challenges that they have to go through. It's one thing to intellectually acknowledge, yeah, we need to do things differently. It's quite another to galvanize bureaucracies to actually fundamentally change. And so I feel much better about where we are, but I always remind the teams that I'm responsible for leading, don't assume for 1 minute that it's perfect or we have perfect knowledge. That is a trap that we do not want to fall into.
One of the things that came up in the discussion, we've only just started, so you didn't miss much.
We talked about you most of the time. So.
We made
Well,
fun of you,
Roger
but
screwed that up.
yeah,
He didn't
that's
do
right.
that.
Boy, it's lucky NSA is in here because no, the thing that came up was
They're always listening.
Yeah, do we have the tools that we need? And in particular, one of the points I think it was Matt who said it is, you know, we do have the kind of almost overwhelming military capabilities. And for me, when I look at some of the folks we're playing with now, they've developed strategies and tactics to avoid military confrontation, to work around that. So what are the tools we need? How do we deal with a more flexible set of opponents than maybe we had in the past? And why don't we just go down the row? I don't know. Mark, do you want to go first? Or?
Sure. I mean, goes back to one of the themes that we've had in the beginning of this conversation is how difficult some of these threats are, how adaptive the threat actors have been, whether we're talking in the terrorism realm or in the cyber realm. To me, it's just thinking about the threat, and then that will lead to the tools part. But it does seem to me that we're in this very vulnerable state right now, there's a combination between the cyber world and the terrorism world where there's some parallels. So the attacks like in Nice or in San Bernardino or Orlando are similar to attacks in the cyber realm, like Sony. For example, or the mini attacks on commercial entities, in the sense that they're asymmetric, so a small number of people can have an outsized impact, and one or two people can, whether it's cyber or terrorism, can have a significant impact. They're very difficult to stop. We don't really have I think coming back to the tools point, we don't really have that effective tools generally. These attacks are gonna get through, and they can happen anywhere. So there's this sense of vulnerability because you can be in a grocery store or a bar and be subject to attack, certainly in the terrorism realm, and then the same thing in cyber. Sitting in your home, you can have your data stolen. And then the third part of it, to my mind, why there's parallels is that the government isn't in a position to stop all these attacks. So one of the things I didn't talk about a lot when I was in office at NCTC was, and you guys are maybe constrained a little bit, but I didn't usually say we can't stop everything, congressman or senator. We're only as good as we can be. I would say we strive to be 100%, but there's a reality that we're in a risk management business in the government, trying to minimize the impact, and that's just a reality of the threat. And I think it's true across the cyber and terrorism realm. Tools, and maybe I'll pass it off to Adam, but one of the main tools is intelligence, and I think there's a risk there that we're not as good at, or we're losing some of our tools and authorities on the intelligence side.
Yeah, to me, it's not new tools or new capabilities that come to mind. It's the very public debate that was had over the San Bernardino attacker's phone. That's a fulcrum on which national security is going to hinge, and that debate's going to occur in a lot of different frameworks, whether it's communications, whether it's financial trails, whether it's satellite or landlines or internet. We as a society need to figure out how we want to arbitrate that, and I think our capabilities within the government are going to very much depend on that. The other thing I would say, it's not a capability, but given what Matt was saying about the fact that there will be always the ability to carry out attacks, especially if you're talking about lone wolf, standalone attacks, no matter how good our intelligence is, no matter how well synchronized we are within the government, there's the question of how resilient we are. And you see different cultures when you go around to different parts of the world. Terrorism is sadly afflicting many, many countries in many parts of the world. And in some countries, there's a sort of a culture of resilience that does factor in the fact that there will be terror attacks and some will be successful. And they're great tragedies, and we need to redouble our efforts to combat them. But in terms of the national psyche, then, how lasting is the wound and how long does it take to recover from it? That differs, I think, from country to country. And I lived in Israel for 2 years. Obviously, that's a country that's really grappled with this for many, many decades now, has tremendous resilience. It's hard to just adopt that, but it is, I think, going to be a challenge as we go forward into the coming decades.
So from my perspective, if you look at ISIL as an example, I try to make a few points. Number one, there is no one single threat or methodology here. You're looking at an opponent that has using multiple methods, multiple techniques, from interaction between areas where the attack is occurring back to individuals in Syria and other places, C2 moving back and forth, some level of coordination and facilitation externally, helping to bring it together, to plots being executed where individuals clearly went, spent some time with the group, and then we're told, hey, return back home, find the right place and time. You don't need anything further from us. To the lone wolf, self-radicalized individual who feels, look, that ideology really resonates with me, and I feel I want to do something right now, today, within my span of control and my capability, and I don't need help from anybody else. The only reason I say that is that's very different than go back 10 years ago when we were looking at a very different AQ model. That means we got to think differently. We can't just count on one methodology, one process. I would also argue one discipline as the single source of all the insight we're going to need. So that, to me, implies we got to think about a broader set of teammates, we got to think about a broader set of capabilities, and then it's how do we align this in a meaningful, real-time way. Now, my piece of the puzzle is that the director of NSA generally tends to be very technically focused. That's the nature of signals intelligence. The concern I have there is we increasingly have a fundamental mismatch between the current state of technology that's available to a host of actors out there, whether it be nation states or individuals, and the legal and the policy frameworks that we have. And our technology has outstripped those frameworks. That's a decision that we collectively as a nation have to come to grips with. Hey, what are we comfortable with here? But we have got to acknowledge that technology is providing a level of capacity and capability to a whole host of actors out there who, quite frankly, 10, 20 years ago, they didn't have access to that kind of capability as readily. And to me, there's implications in that. And we need to sit down and have a dialogue as a nation as to, so what does that mean for us? And what are we comfortable with? And what are the implications for us for our legal and our policy frameworks?
We got some really good questions. We got 312 questions, and 300 of them were, what happens if Cyber Command and NSA splits? So I'm gonna hold that one for the end. If we have time to do it, we will. We'll give the Admiral some breathing room here. I'm gonna rephrase some of them a little bit to fit with the discussion, but we had one on transparency, and people asked, wouldn't we have been better served if we had been more transparent about some of our activities since 9/11? And I wonder if you can talk about the degree of transparency that is best in a democracy without compromising mission success, and whether that's changed. I mean, we're in an environment where people demand more of their government. So when each of you look at it from your experiences, what do you think about transparency? How do we manage the legitimate requests of citizens to know more?
So huge question. So David, I thought your points this morning on sort of along this question in the context of the 215, the metadata program, were spot on. This is one of the points I think is important to make about the transparency question is that this is not a debate or a discussion that occurred starting in the summer of 2013. Mm-hmm. This is something that those folks in this room in the National Security Division have been working on and before that for many, many years, how to get that balance right. And we're going to continue to work on it. It's going to be dynamic, and we're not going to ever really reach a place where it's exactly right, and we're going to have to calibrate and recalibrate. I do think that there is a sort of inflection point that we're undergoing that may actually pose, thinking about next generation threats, I think a potential threat, and that is that the framework we inherited when I was in the National Security Division, and many of you all here too, it was this idea that this deal that was struck in 1978 with intelligence committees conducting oversight and the FISA court reviewing intelligence activities, and then executive branch oversight, and that this would all be done sort of within the context of those institutions, largely out of the sight of the public. And I think what the disclosures in 2013 and sort of the way they came out really rocked the foundation of that basic structure in a way that we're still trying to figure out what's exactly right now. I think we've made some changes that are generally workable and address some of the concerns. I think there are other things, David, you talked about, transparency around the covert action legality. I mean, that's just another example of where there's not as much. Are we going to see a press to be more transparent in that context. And I think there are risks in going too far in the name of transparency, and we're going to have to continue to work hard to make sure we strike the right balance. Luckily, you all have that responsibility, many of you guys in this room.
I had one major incident in my career grappling with this very much firsthand, which was the terrorist finance tracking program. It was uncovered by reporters, and they came to us at Treasury and others in the U.S. government and said they intended to publish what they had found. And we had an extended back and forth with them, urging, pleading, begging them not to, in the course of which we were able to provide them with pretty much backstage access in terms of how the program is run, all the safeguards that attach to it, and show them, not just tell them, but show them why this was so carefully circumscribed and really, we believed, and I still believe, a model of how you'd want the US government to do searches. It was targeted, there was oversight that was outside. We had oversight from multiple oversight bodies, including the outside company, including multiple legal teams, including Congress and an IG. And we were only able to access information if it was responsive to a targeted search. So it is what I think still is the model for how we approach big data questions, not we need to rifle through this information, but we need the information that's responsive when we have an active terrorism search. And it was, as you can imagine, a pretty robust back and forth with the news gathering organization. And for a while, I thought we were about to prevail, because their argument for a while had been, we think there's something fishy going on here, and it's coming up in the context of all these other disclosures about broad data gathering by the Bush administration. This is just yet another example, was the argument of oversteps on intelligence gathering. And we were able to walk them back from some of the more wild accusations they were making, and had them acknowledge the principle that if you've come across a covert program that will be harmed if it's disclosed, and if the covert program seems to be run responsibly with oversight from other branches, in this case Congress, that maybe you don't disclose it. Then it turned out that a competitor of theirs picked up the story and was going to run it, and they ran it the next day. And at some level, this is a business, and I understand that, but I was supremely frustrated by that. And I think that the principles that we were working out are probably good principles, that just because something becomes known doesn't mean it should be published. Transparency isn't the overriding goal. It has to be a balance, obviously.
So for me, the lessons of the last few years are the assumptions that we made when we created the current oversight mechanisms still valid? I wasn't here back in 2008, 2009. But looking at it in hindsight, I suspect part of the rationale was, hey, we are ensuring that the duly elected representatives of our citizens have awareness of what we are doing, and we are ensuring that they are aware of how we are implementing a legal law, Section 215 of the Patriot Act. Hey, we are using a court, an independent entity, to gain authority to do targeted collection. But as we look back on it now, what I have told the team is, so what happens when the foundations of your strategy are no longer trusted in the same way by the very citizens they're supposed to be representing? Does that argue then, hey, look, maybe we need to look at a different approach? You saw this play out in the immediate reaction, I think, in the aftermath of the disclosures, where I think from NSA's perspective, wait a second, we have fully complied with the law. We have kept our congressional overseers fully aware of what we're doing. We have complied with the court every step of the way. And yet, we find ourselves in a situation where you're these people conducting indiscriminate surveillance. I think from an organizational perspective, it truly perplexed part of the team that I'm a part of. I think it goes to the fact that, hey, the dynamic that we're dealing with as a nation is changing. And the level of trust and confidence that we've had in institutions, if we're honest with ourselves, it's not the same today as it was 30, 40 years ago when we created this mechanism and the aftermath, these mechanisms, in the aftermath of the Pike and the Church Commissions. So I think part of the dialogue as we move forward is, if we accept that premise, what are the implications for what oversight and transparency mean? And I think you're going to see that play out in the coming years.
Yeah, this is an internal topic for us because we feel like there's a disconnect now. And so people always say Washington and the rest of the country, but all the things you guys just said about how well the USG works together, I bet if we went sort of a few miles out and did a poll, we wouldn't get that, you know? So how do we reconnect with the voters who, you know, ultimately control this? But maybe we can come back to that theme. There's a question here about international cooperation, and I wanted to pursue that because one of the things we've talked about is how the structures like NSD that we've created here in the US really help us, but you don't necessarily have foreign counterparts. So do you want to talk about international cooperation to the extent you can?
I'll just touch briefly on it, and you guys are more directly involved in your positions. But I go back to something Adam said earlier about seeing what's going on with European counterterrorism and the struggles that those countries are having. And what I saw when I was at the National Counterterrorism Center, there was a number of countries that were looking to set up something like NCTC. And it seems kind of like we sort of take it for granted now that we do this here. But to your point, Adam, I totally agree. We see how difficult it is in other countries and these are, again, not developing countries, but countries in Europe that are having trouble sharing intelligence with law enforcement and vice versa with border security officials. So, international cooperation with us, is pretty high. But what I'm seeing is sort of in some of these countries, especially in Europe, within Europe, it's sort of still a real challenge.
I have nothing to add. I fully agree.
Yeah, I'd echo that. I mean, international partnerships, from NSA's perspective, are foundational to the future for us.
Yeah.
The amount of time that we spend as an organization interfacing with our foreign counterparts, sharing information and insight, trying to focus capabilities. So oftentimes we're not trying to duplicate each other. It's, hey, look, how do we optimize what each of us has rather than trying to replicate and duplicate what each other has. At the same token, I find it a little frustrating at times that the changes, again, because of the trauma we went through, the changes that we have made, when you don't see that in other areas and you're going, okay, where are the forensics from law enforcement for the mobile devices and the digital devices that were rolled up in an arrest? Come on, this is our experiences. It's the insights that you can generate and your ability to do it quickly while it's still fresh. Hey, this often tends to lead to follow-on discoveries, follow-on data connections. It helps build a trail. And yet when it's the local magistrates controls this, as I'm talking to my foreign intelligence counterparts, hey, Mike, I'd love to help you, but the local magistrate controls this. I have no jurisdiction. I can't access or acquire the data. You're just going to have to wait. Or rather than setting up structural processes, at times I will watch this in a couple cases devolve almost to just a personal relationship. Well, I can't formally share this, but hey, I got a buddy in U.S. organization X, Y, or Z. I'll just give him or her the data, and I'm thinking this is not a good way for us to be doing business.
I'll just add, I had a bizarre experience along those lines. Most countries in the world now have something called a financial intelligence unit, which is not doing intelligence the way we all probably would understand it with a capital I, but they're in charge of all the filings that come in from banks and money service businesses. So if there's a suspicious filing or if somebody comes in carrying more than $10,000 worth of cash, those reports are filed with the financial intelligence unit. And their job is to sift through that data and try to make recommendations, typically to law enforcement, to prosecutors, among other jobs. And I was visiting a country recently where they told me, we can only work up a case until a level of sort of probable cause or criminal suspicion. Once we hand it to a prosecutor, if they choose to open an investigation, we're not allowed to know what happens or ask any questions after that. You can imagine what, sort of the throwing the case over the wall model. We used to have some semblances of that within our system, but it's really debilitating for well-meaning civil servants in these countries who are just trying to do the right thing and get the bad guys.
Well, we've talked about the wonderfulness of cooperation, and there's a couple questions here that kind of take the opposite point of view, and I'll merge them a little bit, which is that where are the areas where you still have disagreements? The specific one was between NSD and the intelligence community, but where isn't cooperation? Where could we, I'll rephrase it in a positive way, where could we strengthen cooperation within the USG? And
Mike?
Sure. As a matter of fact, coincidentally, I was just talking to my team about this earlier today. I still think at times there are some areas where I see less of an emphasis on outcomes and a little bit more on control, if that makes sense. And I'm constantly talking about, guys, what we ought to be striving for is how do we generate outcomes within the constraints that we all have to operate on. That should be the driver. And could we, and I talked to my own workforce about this, could we focus a whole lot less on control as to who owns this, per se? We aren't going to get to speed and agility if we can't do this in a different way. We've also got to get to scale. The other concern I have is the scale and complexity of the problem set is increasing exponentially. How do you get to scale in a global way, given this multi-tiered strategy we're watching these opponents use against us? I don't have the immediate answer, but I'm just struck by there's a lot. And in fact, that was one of the challenges I just talked to my team about was, guys, how do we get to scale given this environment? We've got to deal with this on a global basis. We've got to do it within the constructs of privacy and the rights of our citizens. Don't get me wrong, in the law. That's fundamental to what we do. But within that structure, how do we get to scale? And then is there a chance for us to step back and ask ourselves, what are the changes potentially that we need?
I have a thought. I mean, when you initially asked the question, I was so focused on executive branch that I kind of drew a blank. But when I think about more broadly our government as a whole, then I obviously include Congress in particular and some of the challenges on the executive branch side we faced in better cooperation, relations, more productive and constructive interaction with Congress. And I sort of experienced both, I think, a really good set of experiences under certain leaders of the intelligence committees and certainly less constructive. And it kind of ebbs and flows with the political season. But the other issue, of course, then is budgets and, making sure that the intelligence community is funded, year to year, and we don't go through, Mike, obviously you guys have experienced it, we've experienced it, but not at the scale you did, and in terms of facing, budget being cut off and talking about who's not going to come to work the next day, and how disruptive that is to an enterprise as big as you run, Mike, at NSA. Extremely disruptive, and that is obviously no way to run a railroad.
Mm-hmm.
One of the places I encounter the tension on information sharing is around security clearances, and there seems to be a pendulum effect going back and forth in terms of how many people we clear in, how much information we're putting out into the community of those who have high-level clearances but may not have every compartment. And that's the tension between all this great cooperation and information sharing that we've been talking about, results-oriented, one team, one fight, and then you have a Snowden, and people say, wait a minute, why was this one person given access to so much? This should be need to know. It should be only within those who have the right compartments. And I think that's going to be with us forever, that tug and pull back and forth. But I encounter it, just to speak as a bureaucrat, whenever we pare back or redouble our clearance process in order to get new employees given their security clearances, it has a direct impact on us being able to do our work. And so if you have a natural turnover of employees who are leaving just due to attrition every year, and the amount of time it takes to bring on a new hire goes from 3 months to 6 months to maybe 15 months, you're really talking about an impediment to doing the job. And that's going to be something, as I said, I think is going to be with us for a while.
Yeah, can I echo again something Matt said, that as a leader of an organization, we often talk about the intel world as this monolithic machine that just operates very independently in a very hierarchical way, and everything's on autopilot. Folks, in the end, these are motivated men and women trying to work hard to do what they believe is the right thing the right way. And you could get rid of all of our technical capabilities, you could get rid of all the tools, but the greatest thing we got going for us is the men and women who are really focused on generating in-depth knowledge, insight, and applying it to generate outcomes. As we're working our way through this problem set, I'm always mindful, don't ever forget the human dimension of all of this, because as we're working our way through this, if we lose this workforce, we fundamentally have problems. And, sequestration. The number one issue personnel-wise I've had to deal with in some ways in the last 3 years was when we shut the government down the first time, the workforce looked at me like, I thought the work we did was important and it was valued and it was necessary, and yet you're telling me I can't come to work tomorrow. And the law says, and I told them this, the law says if you show up to work, I will have you removed from the building. Because the workforce's attitude is, I love what I do. I'm going to be here. I can go through some period of time without money. I'll be here tomorrow. And we're literally I put out a statement to the workforce, under federal law, you cannot come to work. And if you show up, you will be forcibly removed. Please don't do this. I know you want to. Please don't do this. When a couple of years later, we had even the hints in media reporting of a shutdown. It's the biggest spike in personnel concern and anxiety I've experienced in the 2.5 years I've been the director at NSA. Sir, is this going to happen again? Is this the future? I can make a whole lot more money on the outside and get a whole lot more stability if this is the way I'm going to get treated. And I'm going, please stay with us, trust us. The nation believes in you, and we need you. Every time we go through these machinations, though, there's just another seed of doubt in the workforce about, well, you say X, but what I really see you do is Y, and what I see you doing really concerns me. I apologize.
Yeah.
You're right.
Well, we got time for a couple more questions, so I'm going to try and merge them. We have one that's fun because it gives you a chance to criticize John, who's sitting there in the front row.
There you go, John.
I'll paraphrase it a little bit, but the question is, what capabilities do you think NSD should get in the future? What do they need to do better? And maybe related to that, to merge them, is what does Treasury need to do to deal with getting the information it needs? And this is sort of an encryption question, which I'd made up my mind not to ask, but what is it we need to see in these two organizations? And Mike, you're a support agency for them. What do you need to do to support both NSD, NCTC, or Treasury better in the future? So I don't know who wants to take that one first.
Jack, I'll go first. So in terms of, for John and the team, we've broadly had this discussion. Speed is probably the biggest thing for me. Because, hey, we got a formal process we have to go through, and we got to make sure that it's done appropriately. So when we approach the court, we've got a well-reasoned case that meets a legal standard and that's well thought out and is compelling. So those are all good attributes. At the same time, our national inclination is, can we go faster? Can we go faster? Can we go faster? We want to get permission because we want to generate something that's actionable because we're concerned. Because the goal, I always remind people, look, the fundamental goal for us is to stop things before they happen. It isn't to respond in the aftermath of an event. Not that that's not part of our jobs, but the true goal, that what drives us and shapes us, is get ahead of this and stop it from ever happening. That leads you sometimes, to a little fundamental different approach, the speed piece, being really important. What I think that we, NSA, could be doing better is, I've talked to the team about, we've got to do a better job of being more articulate in plain English with NSD and with the court. At times, it is not always a strength for us. We are an organization of SIGINT professionals who at times tend to think that whoever they're talking to is a SIGINT professional. I have to remind them, guys, we have to take this down to a level where people who aren't immersed in this mission can understand what we're talking about and what we're asking and why. That's something that we as an organization, I think, have to work on. The other thing, and I'll shut up because I don't want to take all your guys' time. One kudos I want to give to NSD, in at least one scenario, I had asked, hey, could I speak to the court? I want to make sure I understand the court's concerns, and I want to hear it straight from them. I want to be able to interface with them and make sure they know that I understand what they're telling me. And I have to admit, I thought when we did this at the time, it would be ooh, Mike, we're not so sure, what are you, that's not your role. And yet, NSD I thought was great. Hey, we'll talk to the court, and if they're comfortable doing it, we're fully supportive, because we think dialogue between the organizations that are generating this insight, that's showing up at the court, that's asking the court to do something, I thought that was really great. I really thought that was a positive for the court.
No, you're
and
supposed to be critical.
for us.
Sorry.
I wish I
thank
could
you.
be.
Yeah.
We got every bit as much challenger, if not more, than our NSD teammate.
Adam?
I mean, my mom definitely raised me that you don't come into a home when you're invited by the host and then criticize the host. So even if I had good things to lob at John, I don't think this would be the moment. But I do want to speak about something that I think NSD is itself, under John's leadership, trying to do better, that I think is vital, and it's really important for my office too, which is being more nimble about not how quickly we use our existing tools, but thinking outside the box. I realize it's a cliche, and outside of our conventional tools and our conventional definitions of success. I think for Office of Prosecutors, conventional success is indictments and convictions, and you can kind of grade yourself based on how many people you put away. For us, maybe the equivalent is enforcement actions, civil fines, sanctioning companies or countries, how much money have we frozen. But I find more and more with the types of threats we've been discussing on this panel, the lone wolf actors, the non-state actors who are overseas, who are never going to come within our jurisdiction, who are not going to be subject to either Treasury's regulatory authorities or Justice's prosecution authorities. What are we doing about them if that's the new world that we're combating? And I think John's really been very forward-thinking on this, to say there might be things we do that don't involve 18 USC, that involve bringing Treasury in to see if you can do something. And for our part, what we are increasingly thinking is maybe we don't add someone to a sanctions list. Maybe the intel value of leaving that person unnoticed, or leaving the fact that we know about that person unremarked in public, exceeds the value that we would have of a public action. But maybe we can work behind the scenes to disrupt financial flows in a way that's less visible, but maybe almost as effective. That type of thinking, I think, is really incumbent on all of us if we're going to keep up with these next generation threats.
So the thing that probably bothers me the most, or my criticism about John, and actually this applies to George Toscas and Tosh, is that they don't seem to get any older in these jobs. They look exactly the same as they did, I don't know, George, 10, 15 years ago. You haven't changed one bit. And I'm not sure what kind of deal you guys made with the devil to be able to not age.
But he wants to sign up.
Yeah,
He wants to sign up.
something is going on there. I would, I had the same thought as you, Adam. I think that the challenge is being, and I was a prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office and measured success by prosecutions and guilty verdicts. And being a national security division lawyer is a very different way of thinking about when you're successful, when you've, and it may be more difficult to identify, the metrics of being effective and successful as an attorney. And thinking about the bully pulpit, John, that you use so successfully on cyber, that's a real measure of success. And thinking about, when I was at NCTC, when thinking about the lone wolf, as particularly the young, potentially radicalized person, and thinking about off-ramps to criminal activity. When can you identify someone early enough in that process of being radicalized that you might be able to intervene, maybe with the FBI, maybe with the local school teacher, to stop that person from becoming mobilized to violence? That's the Justice Department, and NSD has a role in advising and figuring out creative and innovative ways to stop someone, to your point, Mike, before they carry out an attack. But it's not the typical tool of arrest and prosecution that we're also used to as attorneys. So that's a challenge, and I think you're largely taking it on, but I think it will continue to be a challenge going forward.
So let me, pardon me, let me pick up on that with a question. We've talked about lone wolves, we've talked about cyber, we've talked about some of the hard opponents we face, both state and non-state. How do you develop effective countermeasures against these people? Countermeasures both to deter them, ideally, and countermeasures to, frankly, punish or retaliate when you need to. And one of the things I'm going to take off the table right off the bat is a military response. I just think in a lot of these cases, our opponents deliberately seek to avoid situations that will allow the U.S. to use force because they know they aren't going to win, right? So what does countermeasures look like in this environment where you have non-state actors and cyber threats that are opaque at best? What are good countermeasures? How do you develop them?
So, I think when we've talked, this morning, the former Assistant Attorney General's talked about this, and I think it remains incredibly viable, and that's criminal prosecution in federal courts. I think we saw that with the indictment of in the cyber context, the Chinese actors. I think we continue to see it in the terrorism realm in bringing individuals to justice in our federal courts, which not only have the impact of incapacitating those individuals with long sentences, but send a message to the rest of the world. I think that's very effective about what we will do and how long our reaches and how long our memories are about people who seek to do harm to American citizens in the United States or around the world. So I'm just a huge believer in the power of prosecution in our federal courts, and I think that tool as a countermeasure remains as viable and as important as ever.
Adam, how about sanctions?
Sanctions seems to be the tool of the day, both in the executive branch and in Congress, when you're talking about these overseas threats and not wanting to have recourse to the military tool. What can we do that will have concrete impact if we're never going to get jurisdiction over this threat? People increasingly turn to targeted sanctions. Can we freeze their assets? Can we cut off their pillars of support in terms of revenues? Can we make it harder for them to engage and isolate them? And obviously, I'm a huge proponent of sanctions well used. I've been in this field now for about 14 years and have seen them used very effectively against state and non-state actors. But I'll be the first to tell you, not every threat lends itself as easily to this tool. If you're talking about narcotics cartels, they're very much focused on assets. That's their reason for existing, is to earn money. And they need access to the international financial system in lots of ways, to store their money, to launder their money, to move their money, and they're very vulnerable to this tool. If we can develop the intelligence, if law enforcement can help us with sources, we can have a truly massive impact on a narcotics cartel or a transnational criminal organization. Now, contrast that with a hacker who's sitting in a garage somewhere who's conducting cyber attacks against us. How vulnerable are they if we could figure out their name, their true address, and put it on our designation list? Far less. So we just have to continue to use the tools that Treasury offers, but also be mindful of their strengths and their limitations.
So I think what I would take away so far, there's no one silver bullet here. There's no one single capability, there's no one single tool that's going to solve this issue. To me, it starts from we need to generate fundamental deep knowledge of who they are, how they operate, what's the background, what's the infrastructure. How does the money flow? What are the capabilities they need? What are the key relationships that enable them? How do they communicate? How do they execute command and control? How do they move people? How do they facilitate their own processes? Then once we generate deep knowledge, it's okay. So how do we start to sever these links? What are the tools we can apply? Does sanction make sense here? Does prosecution arrest make sense there? Does military kinetic make sense in this environment? Are there ways to bring pressure on key enabling relationships that are supporting them? I think, it kind of goes to, in some ways to me, I just think of the analogy, look, in many ways, there's some scenarios where this isn't true, but in many ways, we're watching a network. We got to get better knowledge of this network, and we got to understand it as a network. And then we can get smarter about, so where do we start to break the links and the connections that enable this thing?
Maybe one more question building off that before we turn to splitting Cyber Command and NSA.
Let's go out with a bang.
And so thank you for, somebody wrote, Google has harnessed all kinds of innovative technologies for advertising purposes, targeted campaigns against terrorism. How do we harness innovation like that in each of the missions that Matt used to have and Adam and Mike, you still have? what do we do to connect with the private sector? What do we do to connect with its innovation capabilities? Matt, I don't know if you want to go first.
Just very
since you're in the
short,
business.
briefly. I mean, I do think one of the, as much as we've made a lot of progress, I think, post-Snowden in regaining trust with the American people and rebuilding connections with our allies, I think we remain in a deficit with the technology community that continues to hamper cooperation and undermine our efforts on counterterrorism in particular. And so I think that's an area that is going to remain, and I think NSD has a significant role really in helping to lead the effort to, and I think you're doing that, John, and I've seen it, rebuild those relationships, some of it quietly, some of it more openly, but being able to work in cooperation with those centers of innovation and ingenuity, like in Silicon Valley, are absolutely essential to gaining the tools that you described, Mike, but on a whole range of issues, including what I saw at NCTC in being able to really make best use of, leverage the enormous amounts of data that we had access to.
Yeah, I'm seeing that every day, which is, yes, the adversaries are incredibly resourceful and creative. There's some really brilliant, energetic, creative people in government as well. And we've been trying to use the financial data we have, which can be very valuable, in creative ways. So FinCEN, which is the office that collects our financial intelligence unit, that collects banking data from all the financial institutions in the US, looks to run algorithms against that data to figure out, are there patterns that we can associate? And after a lone wolf attack, look back, are there transactions or patterns that could have allowed us to flag this person for law enforcement, for the intelligence community in advance? Sometimes no, but sometimes actually yes, there are patterns. And can we then promulgate that and alert colleagues in FIUs around the world so that they're running the same things? And sometimes it can be as simple and basic as individuals who go travel to be foreign fighters often will wire money to themselves and then withdraw it from an ATM in locations in Turkey, for example, along the border with Syria. Well, that should be an automatic flag. If somebody's a US resident who's pulling money out of an ATM in Baghdad, in a Turkish border town, that's something that should immediately inspire some further interest. But taking that to a more sophisticated level, there are a lot of other questions we can be asking, and that's a way that technology can be harnessed and can be our friend.
I would agree with Adam and Matt.
So, Mike, the one question you didn't get that I want to hit you up with, not the split question. You can do that one on your own if you want. We opened up by saying, so what are the next generation threats you think about? You know, what are the ones looking down the pike? And I know you've got NSA 21, did I get that right?
Right.
Which looks out, 25 years? Both Matt and Adam talked about the next generation threats they're thinking about. What do you think about when you think next generation threats?
So for me, when I think about near term, because I always, I've been, as I said, I've been doing intel for 30 years, and what I found is at some point your ability to project over time, longer durations, we just haven't had a really high success rate. So I generally focus, hey, what are the near to midterm kind of challenges where I think you got a higher probability of accurately predicting the future? And I'll focus really on the cyber piece more than a little more narrowly. To date, most of the cyber activity we've seen is about penetrating systems for the theft of data. What happens when the focus becomes penetration of systems for the manipulation of data and data integrity comes into question? I mean, think about our financial system. It is based on the fundamental premise that you can trust that the data you are seeing that is reflecting global, near instantaneous activity is an accurate description of monetary flow. What happens when the trust is gone? As a military guy, what happens when the tactical picture that I'm looking at to help shape my decision process, it doesn't reflect reality? And in fact, it's driving me to make choices that in fact are helping the opponent, not generating the outcomes that we want. The second thing that concerns me, data increasingly has a value in and of itself. Because of the power of big data analytics, I can remember 15 years ago looking at database concentrations and thinking, this is so large, nobody could really fully harness and generate knowledge and insight. Those days are long gone. So you're watching data now have an incredible attractiveness just to get sheer volumes of it, to do pattern analysis and big data analytics to generate insight. That's a whole different challenge for all of us as we're trying to deal with it. The next one really is what happens when non-state actors stop viewing the internet and the World Wide Web as a communication mechanism, as a mechanism to coordinate, as a mechanism to generate revenue, as a mechanism to spread their ideology and to recruit, and they start viewing it as a weapon system. Because most nation states, while they want to gain an advantage, they generally are unwilling to destroy the status quo to gain the advantage. They view that there's some benefit from the broad structures that we've put in place to ensure stability over time. The non-state actor, I would argue, and ISIL kind of being the poster child at the moment, the status quo they seek to destroy. They want to totally replace the systems and the mechanisms that we have in place now. They have no interest in sustaining the status quo. Their threat calculus, their decision-making is totally different. What happens when they start viewing this thing as a weapon to be turned against a whole broader set of partners out there? And then lastly, in a little bit of the longer term, I'm always thinking to myself, what are the implications of machine learning and artificial intelligence for us? I think the benefits far outweigh the negatives. I think it's a real positive, but I do think to myself, as I'm trying to think about how you defend against these kind of capabilities, boy, what are the implications for a world in which this becomes much more common, much more broadly dispersed?
Well, we have a lot more questions, and I want to apologize to the people whose questions I didn't get to, but I know Adam has, Adam has a date on the Hill with the senator. We don't want to stand in the way of that. So please join me in thanking our panel.
You got one.
Thanks, Matt. Get it out.
Hey, folks, we've got a couple of closing remarks if you want to hang out. Thanks.
We're going to do, I just wanted to thank you in closing for being here today. It was a remarkable event taking us through more than 10 years of history in a day's time. But most importantly, I think you've heard about the role of National Security Division from the current leaders of agencies ranging from FBI, NSA, and CIA. And I think they'd be the first to tell you there's this musical, Hamilton musical that people are quoting now, and they talk about the room where it happens. And you've heard from a lot of people today who are in the Situation Room, the so-called room where it happens, or are sitting with the president. And they would be the first to tell you, as would I, that that is not the room where it happens. Nothing happens there. You have a lot of informed discussion. But what you're trying to do there is support the rooms where it really happens. And that's with people like the men and women who work day in and day out in the National Security Division to confront threats that most of us don't want to spend time thinking about, that are unimaginable in terms of their consequences. And they're a group of dedicated career professionals who do this, not only who don't get credit for the work that they're doing day in, day out, but don't want it. They don't want to be in the limelight. They just take the quiet satisfaction of knowing when they come in the morning, when they leave that night, when they go home to their friends and family, that their friends and family are safer because of the work that they put in that day. So I just wanted to end with a note and maybe a round of applause for the people